Hi everybody, today we are going to learn how to solve equations that have variables on both sides. So we're going to start off with one really important piece of vocabulary, which we're going to use a lot today, and it's coefficient. So coefficient is what we call the number that's in front of each variable. So it's also the number that's being multiplied to each variable. So in this case, the full term is negative 2x. X is my variable, and negative 2, just the number, is my coefficient. And the coefficient really just tells you how many of that variable you have. Okay, so now let's talk about how do we solve an equation that has a variable on both sides of your equal sign. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find the variable with the smaller coefficient. This is going to be the variable that we want to move. So since they're on both sides, we're going to need to move one of them. It's going to be easier for us to move the one with the smaller coefficient. So we can move that variable using our inverse operation, which will be either addition or subtraction. So if it's a positive variable, we're going to subtract it from both sides, and if it's a negative variable, we're going to add it to both sides. And then from there, you should have a two-step equation or something that you already know how to finish solving. So I do want to make sure we can understand which number is smaller, because sometimes when negatives are involved, it gets a little bit trickier. So if we have something like, I ask you, well, which one's smaller, 5 or 12? I think everyone would tell me that it's 5. Or maybe if we have negative 1 or 4, most people would tell me that negative 1 is smaller than 4. But what happens if we have something like positive 2 or negative 8? So it'd be really common for me to hear that negative 8 is bigger because it's an 8. However, since my 8 is negative, it's actually smaller. A negative number is always going to be smaller than a positive number. And in fact, for negatives, the bigger it looks, the smaller it actually is because it's more negative. So if you have something like this, I know that negative 12 looks bigger because 12 is bigger than 9, but negative 12 is more negative. So once again, for negative numbers, the bigger it looks, the smaller it actually is. All right, so let's try some of these following those 3 steps that we talked about earlier. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to notice that I have a variable on the right and a variable on the left. Here, my coefficient is 4, and here my coefficient is that invisible 1. So I can see that this variable on the right is smaller. So this is the one I'm going to move using the inverse operation. Since that's a positive x, I'm going to subtract x from both sides. 4x minus 1x is 3x, and then I have minus 1 equals x minus x is 0. I'm left with 26. So now I'm going to do the inverse of subtraction, and I'm going to add 1 to both sides. 3 times x equals 27. And now I'm going to do the inverse of multiplication, and I'm going to divide by 3 on both sides. 3 divided by 3 is 1, so 1x equals 9. 27 divided by 3. Now let's look at the second example. So for part B, I see I have a variable on the left, a variable on the right. I want to remind you that you cannot combine those two variables because they are on different sides. In the past, we would try to combine things that have the same variable. However, you cannot combine terms that are on different sides. So we have to move one. So now I'm wondering, well, what's smaller, negative 5 or positive 3? So negative 5x is my smaller term. So I'm going to move it using the inverse operation, which is to add 5x to both sides. What I have left, be careful here, is negative 6. Remember, this minus sign belongs to the 6, so don't let it disappear. Equals 3x plus 5x equals 8x, and then I have plus 8. So now I'm going to start by doing the inverse of addition, and I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. Please be careful right here. Here I look at this and I say, well, I'm starting negative and I'm getting more negative. My answer is definitely negative. But since they are the same type of number, they're both negatives, I'm going to add up the values. 8 plus 6 is 14. So I'm left with negative 14 equals 8 times x, because 8 minus 8 is 0. The inverse of multiplication is division, so I'm going to divide both sides by 8. And then you can see here, well, 8 doesn't go in evenly to 14. So I am going to have a fraction as my answer. I have negative 14 over 8 equals 1x. However, whenever you get an answer that's a fraction, there's one thing you always need to check for, and that's if you can simplify. So remember, the way we simplify fractions is by looking at the numerator and the denominator and asking ourselves, is there some number that goes in evenly to both my numerator and denominator? So I have 14 and 8. Both of those numbers are divisible by 2. So I can divide by 2 on the top and the bottom. You need to show both. And what I have left is negative 7 over 4 equals x. Now before you box your answer, you should check to see if you can divide more. However, there's no number that goes in evenly to both 7 and 4, so our answer is negative 7 over 4 equals x. All right, at this point, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and give these two a try. We'll check our answers in just a few seconds. Okay, go ahead and check your work here. Remember, it's always going to be easier for us to move the variable with the smaller coefficient. So here, the inverse of positive 2x is negative 2x on each side, leaving us with 3x on the right. And then I'm going to subtract 7. Please check this number. 4 minus 7 is negative 3. I have more negatives, so my answer is negative. And then we should end up with the final answer, negative 1 equals x. For part B, or the second part, negative 1 is smaller than positive 8. So I'm going to move this term by adding x to both sides, the opposite of subtracting x. And from there I have all of my x's are on the same side, and I'm left with 9 of them. Then you can subtract 2 and divide by 9. And since we have a fraction, we're going to check to see if we can simplify, which in this case we can. Our final answer should be 7 over 3 equals x. Okay, let's try two more together. So here we have negative 5x equals negative 2x plus 21. So here, remember, the negative that looks bigger is actually smaller. So negative 5x is actually my smaller value. So the opposite of negative 5x is plus 5x. So I'm going to do that on both sides. Now at this point, sometimes people panic because they think something is wrong, because negative 5x plus 5x is just 0. It's okay to have 0 on one side of your equation. 0 is a number just like any other number. Here I have 5x minus 2x, giving me 3x plus 21. And now you can see I have a positive variable here, and then I just need to do a two-step equation. So the inverse of plus 21 is minus 21 on both sides. Negative 21 equals 3 times x. The inverse of multiplication is division. And I'm left with negative 7 equals 1x. All right, let's try this last one together. Now here, I see I have negative 6x on the left and negative 10x on the right. I cannot combine them because they are on different sides of the equal sign. So I'm going to need to move one of them. The smaller term here is negative 10x. Remember, it's more negative, so it's smaller. The inverse of negative 10x is going to be to add 10x to each side. So here I have 10x minus 6x, which is 4x. Now I'm going to do the inverse of addition, and I'm going to subtract 9 from each side. 4 times x equals negative 6. Remember, I have more negatives, so my answer will be negative. But they are different types of numbers, so when they're different, we subtract. 9 minus 3 is 6. From here, the inverse of multiplication is division, and I'm left with 1x equals negative 6 over 4. But remember, whenever we have a fraction, we need to check to see if we can simplify. In this case, we can divide the numerator and denominator by 2. And what we have left is x equals negative 3 over 2. All right, go ahead and pause the video and give these last few a try. Okay, let's go ahead and check your work. So here, remember the smaller term is x, so I'm going to move that term using the inverse. And then we just have 2 more steps, and we should get x equals negative 2. Make sure you're correcting your work. And then here, my smaller term is negative 7x. Remember, it's more negative. The inverse of that is adding 7x, so I add 7x to each side, leaving me with 6x on the right. And then a 2-step equation. Now be careful, we end up with 16 over 6, which can be simplified by dividing the numerator and denominator by 2. So our final answer should be 8 over 3 equals x. All right, that is all for today. Thank you so much for watching.